the only other thing I was going to do before we dive into the lecture is just show you guys some props here. So I think I mentioned maybe I mentioned this like on our introductions, day one, how I used to teach at Johnson County Community College, and this is my second year teaching here full time. And right before I applied here, I was actually getting ready to teach an ancient philosophy class over at Johnson County Community College. So I was like fervently researching and like completely all in this ancient philosophy stuff. So actually this lecture that we're going to go through today on these prototype philosophers, Socrates and Plato, this is the newest lecture that I've constructed, and it's basically only 2 years old, right? So it stems from all this research I did. And so I just wanted to mention, I got a lot of props here. Like I said, I was doing a lot of research. And then it was kind of a weird deal because I was probably about 2/3 done prepping for this class. I had all these lessons. And then I got this job here. So it's like, okay, just toss all that aside. Although, like I mentioned, I did get this lecture out of it. So a lot of what we're going to talk about reflects, again, kind of some of the research I had to do for that class. And so in view of that, I wanted to just kind of show you guys some props or, just some of the ancient philosophy stuff. So the Republic is arguably maybe the most famous book. I would argue the most famous book in philosophy, and it's arguably, I'm a little biased, right, but I would argue that it's one of the best books of all time, period. In fact, it might even be number one for me. I'd have to think about that a little bit more, but it's one of those books where it's kind of like one of those works of art. Kind of a nice feature of like really good works of art is that when you return to them, you go back to them, you kind of get something new from them each time. So like Dark Side of the Moon, I think I've referenced how you'll never meet anyone who's listened to Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd more than yours truly. But sometimes I'll still go back and listen to that album and still hear things I swear that I've never heard before, right? It's kind of like, wow. And the same thing with the Republic. It's kind of the point here that each time I go back and read it, I probably read through it in its entirety at least 4 or 5 times. And each time it gives you something kind of new that you didn't see before. So anyway, the Republic is such a big deal in philosophical circles that you have like tons of different translations. So just myself here, I've got several. Here's a couple, and then just within this as well, right, there's another translation. I wanted to put a couple books in particular on your radar because I'll be actually citing them fairly extensively, not just in this first lecture, but then also in the next lecture as well, lecture 5 on Socratic wisdom. So first, they're kind of both introductions to, they're pretty well known in philosophical circles as being really good introductions to ancient philosophy, basically. So this one, Before and After Socrates by F.M. Cornford, is kind of a well-known one. And then, so too, The Greek Philosophers from Thales to Aristotle by W.K.C. Guthrie. So you're going to see me, so I'm putting these kind of on your radar. You're going to see me referencing and quoting these two in particular quite a bit. So these are the books that I'm referencing. Another really good source, if you get into philosophy at all, there is a really good history of philosophy that a guy named Frederick Copleston put together. And so a couple really good resources, a couple books. There's like, I have them all at home. And I want to say there's like 16 or 17 in this entire history. And so here are literally the first 2 in that series, and they're dealing in ancient philosophy. So another good resource. And then all of these are just, not only do you have kind of different translations of the Republic, but then you also have entire books where, the scholars, Plato's scholars, are trying to interpret then what Plato's actually suggesting in the Republic. And there's lots of debate and discussions about that. One of my favorites is like, there's this suggestion after the philosopher gets enlightened ascending out of the cave of ignorance, okay? The allegory of the cave. We're not going to have time to necessarily discuss that in detail in here, but I highly encourage you. There is the excerpt of the allegory of the cave, one of the most famous portions of philosophy ever, is in our textbook. I highly encourage you guys to check that out. I had to kind of eliminate it just because we only have so much time, right? But the whole point here is in the Republic, there's this famous portion called the Allegory of the Cave, or referenced as that, where the philosopher kind of gets enlightened and sees the truth for what it is, and then it sort of escapes the cave of ignorance. And then there's this discussion then, well, then what, right? Does the philosopher have an obligation towards his fellow humans to descend back down into the cave of ignorance and try to enlighten them, right? There's this whole then discussion and debate. And that's a big debate in the scholarship, because that's what the suggestion is in the Republic, but did Plato really mean that literally? Okay, so there's this back and forth. And I argue, actually in some of my own work, that he had to have meant it ironically or not literally. Right? Because after all, look what happens when philosophers try to get involved in society. What happens to Socrates, as we're going to see? He gets killed. What happens to Aristotle towards the end of his life? He also gets condemned and has to flee Athens. Right? So to what extent did Plato really mean, right, that we have an obligation as enlightened philosophers to become involved politically and socially? Did he really mean that literally or not? That's just one example then of what these guys then in entire books are discussing and debating, right, on the Republic. Right? They have the entire books then just interpreting what's actually going on in the Republic. So anyway, I wanted to share, again, some props with you guys here, especially these two, like I mentioned. These are going to be the two that I'm really going to be referencing extensively as we push forward. So the objective of today's lecture is, let's go ahead and put this up here. So we've already at this point, through our first 3 lectures, gotten acquainted with philosophy in general, kind of its history, its various major aspects. We tried to establish some value. We talked about kind of the toolbox of the philosopher, right, logic. And so now, in view of all that, we're going to, before we really get into some of the major debates and discussions, we want to introduce some quintessential, I would say, examples of philosophers. Presumably, again, a couple of guys that you've heard of, right, even before you signed up for philosophy. As I mentioned back in lecture 1, you poll average everyday people and say, can you name a philosopher? Insofar as they are going to be able to name one, it's usually one of these 3, Socrates, Plato, and who's that third one? Aristotle. And poor Aristotle, I was thinking about this on the way over today. He does kind of get not a fair, I don't know how to put it, right? We will spend a little bit more time, just because I'm actually more familiar with Socrates and Plato, in fairness, than Aristotle. But I was thinking on the drive over, we have an entire lecture here. We're going to get into Socrates and Plato, and we're going to develop some of their themes in the next lecture. But poor Aristotle, right, not so much. Now, we will reflect on him. I've already introduced him. Right? We have talked about him, but he won't get quite the same treatment, for better or worse, as Socrates and Plato in here. Okay, but yeah, anyway, returning to that idea, Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle, arguably the 3 most famous philosophers, and for good reason. So we're going to introduce, again, get to know Socrates and Plato in particular, try to establish, here's a couple good examples of what we mean by philosophers, get to know them a little bit better. So that's the game plan here. And especially in this first lecture, lecture 4 that is, it's kind of more historical, kind of biographical, giving you kind of an account of Plato and Socrates, their lives. And then we will really get more into the conceptual stuff in the next lecture. Okay, so for better or worse, that's kind of the game plan here. So I try to put most of this stuff up here on the roadmap as usual, up on the board here. Okay, so this first slide, right, introducing Socrates, born in 470 BC, died in 399 BC. So he's, again, an ancient philosopher. Both these guys are. Hopefully that's pretty clear to you guys at this point. Okay. Arguably the most famous philosopher of all time. There is a reason why even non-philosophers are familiar with not only Socrates but Plato. Okay. Plato's teacher, so we remember this from lecture 1 and that acronym. What was that very helpful acronym that your very helpful instructor provided to remember these guys? Yeah, SPA, that's right. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And that's indicative of their lineage, right? Socrates was Plato's teacher and Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Okay. So, yeah, Socrates, no doubt a very formidable influence on Plato. And we'll see that when we get into Plato later in the lecture. We'll see how that's the case. In fact, Socrates is arguably the central figure, especially the earlier on in the dialogues. We'll see later that the dialogues are typically divvied up sort of chronologically. And the earlier dialogues, especially, Socrates is like dominating these dialogues, dominating the discourse. Okay, so that's the point there. Socrates, what an interesting figure. Okay. In many respects, as I indicate on the slide, he was kind of like an average, everyday dude. But then there is a reason why we're still talking about him 2,500 years later, whereas most average, everyday dudes get lost, in the course of history. Okay. So he was normal in a lot of respects. He had 3 kids, a wife, fought and served in the army, and actually kind of gained some fame for being fairly courageous in an instance or two. So in some sense, as I mentioned here, led a rather unremarkable upbringing and life, kind of seemed normal in a lot of respects. But then, as I mentioned at the bottom, again, not really all that normal in other respects. There is a reason why we all know about him thousands of years later. Okay. So again, he is a kind of quintessential philosopher, at least as we've tried to sort of characterize philosophy. Remember Russell and that depiction? It's not a practical sort of thing. It's a good of the mind. It's a kind of psychological good. It doesn't deliver definitive answers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Well, Socrates, again, maps up with that kind of notion of philosophy. He's not a very practical individual, and that is a recurring theme in a lot of these dialogues. And he admits as much. He concedes this very readily in many places in the dialogues. So even in our excerpt, right, he says, quote, "I have nothing to do with physical speculations." His mind he is certainly consumed. He is one that's certainly consumed with the deeper questions, okay, the philosophical stuff. So he really does, again, offer a good representation, I think, of the kind of image of philosophy or a philosopher that we would get from Russell and his depiction of philosophy. Okay. Right? This dude is seemingly engaged in full-time philosophical speculation, as I mentioned here in the slide. Okay, so yeah, Socrates, interesting, fascinating character. He's a very polarizing figure. Okay? People either loved him or hated him, it seemed like. Okay? He developed, kind of as a result of his personality, he developed a kind of cult-like following, which had both benefits and detriments. Okay? So what ended up happening, and I guess you kind of have to a little bit get into the story, then we'll develop this, moving forward again in the next lecture as well. But really, a lot of his troubles, as he says in the Apology, began with the Oracle of Delphi and this suggestion that he's the smartest person on earth. Right? When Socrates has readily admitted throughout his life that all he knows is that he knows nothing. This befuddles, right, this pronouncement on the part of the Oracle befuddles Socrates, and so he basically sets out on a quest to find someone smarter. And so he goes about, and we'll develop some of these themes in more detail as we proceed, but he goes about applying the so-called Socratic method to various individuals throughout the city that suggested they had knowledge. Okay? And in the process, these people, some of whom had a great deal of power, were people in very prestigious positions, involved in politics, etc. So some of these people, again, wielded a great deal of power. And what was interesting and really alluring about Socrates is he treated them the same. Okay? We all know, and maybe this is true of us and we can admit it, some two-faced people, right? People that act one way when it's just you and them, right? Hanging out by yourselves, but then they act completely differently in a crowd when the popular people are around, or and moms and dads are around, right? Socrates, one of the things that was attractive about him is that he really treated everyone the same, no matter who they were, what their positions were. And again, this was really attractive, and it's arguably one of the main features of his character that it sort of got him this cult-like following. But on the flip side, it also then yielded a lot of the animosity towards him, because people don't like to have their ignorance exposed, right? They don't like to be shown their own ignorance, to be made to look like fools, especially in a crowd or in public. And again, Socrates did this wherever, oftentimes in public settings. Okay, so you can see then kind of how the way he behaved and carried himself was very attractive. Right, he gets this cult-like following, but then at the same time, right, when he's investigating these people that suggest they know things, he's ultimately going and through this back and forth and through this dialogue with them, he gets to realize, and the idea is hopefully he gets them to realize that really they didn't know anything. Okay? And this is a very, again, not a pleasant process for his interlocutors, the ones that he's communicating with. And so, again, that is what led to then a lot of the animosity towards him, and arguably, you might say, ultimately his downfall, right, being killed by the city of Athens. So going back to that last slide, as I mentioned, developed a cult-like following, okay, and that's kind of one of the main reasons, right? He had this attractive character. He was confident and courageous enough, again, to treat people the same no matter what their positions were. You know, they might have been very prestigious members of the society, but that wasn't going to stop Socrates from questioning them if they suggested they had knowledge. And I should have mentioned this at the outset. When we're talking about knowledge here, okay, we're talking about the deep stuff, the stuff that matters, you know, why we're here, why there's something and not nothing, all that sort of stuff. So when he says, all I know is that I know nothing, okay, that's the kind of stuff he's talking about. It doesn't mean he doesn't know how to walk, right, or open doors, or things like that, right? Okay. When he says, all I know is that I know nothing, I don't have any wisdom or knowledge, he's talking about the philosophical, deep sort of stuff, okay. Speaking of the Socratic method, I mentioned this earlier, right? So he'd apply, and this is probably a phrase or term that you guys had heard of outside of class, the Socratic method. And it's basically just kind of, when somebody suggests something, it's kind of like this Q&A, this back and forth, right? Where they maybe suggest they know something, and then so you say, oh, that's your view? Well, what about, you know, you ask a kind of a question and response to kind of tease out a little bit more about their position. And so they'll respond, and then you ask kind of maybe a follow-up question, trying to tease out a little bit more, right? So it's this kind of back and forth questioning and answering process to try to, again, solicit exactly what the person's suggesting, right? Or get their view to be as clear as possible. So that's what we mean by the Socratic method. And so Socrates is, again, famous for applying this so-called Socratic method, like I said, to these various individuals who would suggest they had knowledge. Okay? Blah, blah, blah. So I mentioned that is one of the things that was both, it's a polarizing feature of Socrates, right? This really attracted, especially the youth of Athens. They were really enamored with Socrates. And this guy that was courageous enough to stand up and treat everyone the same no matter what. So especially the youth of Athens seemed to be, again, enamored with Socrates. And so this was also, you know, it was good in one sense because they defended Socrates. They were there for Socrates. But at the same time, it was also led in some sense to his downfall because they emulated his ways as well. Right? They also then began applying the Socratic method, trying to emulate Socrates' ways, including to mom and dad. They would apply the Socratic method to mom and dad. And then mom and dad, some of these moms and dads, right, had very powerful positions in the city. And so they wanted to know what got into little Billy all of a sudden. Why is he questioning everything we're saying? And then they figured out, well, lo and behold, it's that Socrates, right? That dang Socrates is causing problems again, getting our kids to question everything we do, et cetera, right? So that was also then sort of problematic for Socrates. He was so inspiring, so alluring, that again, the youth would start trying to emulate his demeanor and the way he carried himself. Right? Which, like I said, when they applied it to the wrong people, so to speak, that ended up being problematic for Socrates. So I'm kind of speaking to then, sort of foreshadowing then why Socrates ends up on trial near the end of his life. Right? These are some of the reasons why. As Guthrie, so I mentioned, right, this is the Guthrie text that I'm referencing here. So as Guthrie suggests, quote, since he regarded it as his mission in life to go around convincing people of their ignorance, it is not surprising that he was unpopular. Now, I don't know, that's a little strong on Guthrie's part. I don't know that Socrates necessarily thought of it as his mission to make sure that everyone around him knew just how stupid they were. I think it was probably more innocent. He was just trying to innocently find someone that truly did have some wisdom so that he could go to the oracle and be like, yo, bro, what's going on here? Clearly, Eddie here actually knows something and I don't. Right? I think that's really was the impetus for him setting about trying to investigate people and find someone wiser. He wasn't trying to make them feel stupid, but that's just what ended up happening as a result, because they really didn't know the things they suggested they knew. Okay? But, again, nobody likes to be made right? Nobody likes to have their own ignorance exposed, much less in a big group, right? In a crowd, right? In a public environment. Down at the bottom I mentioned, and this is on the roadmap here as well, the Socratic method. Sometimes, especially in the scholarship, you might hear it referenced as Elenchus. So that's another kind of buzzword that I mentioned at the bottom of the slide, right? Also referencing that idea of the Socratic method. Okay. Any questions at this point? So we're kind of getting a taste for Socrates and his character, what he was like. He was very true to himself, which was admirable, appreciable. A lot of people respected that. That's why he kind of got the following he did. Okay, but that courage and that consistency also spelled trouble then when he examined the wrong people, so to speak. Lots of interesting facets of this dude named Socrates, including, this question, well, how do we even really know anything about Socrates? Because Socrates famously never wrote anything himself. In fact, he deplored writing. He suggested, I always found this kind of interesting. I can't remember where, if it was in the Guthrie or Cornford, but somebody was kind of talking about, Socrates' position in terms of writing. So he famously, everybody's kind of knows that Socrates didn't actually write anything himself. And why was that? Well, he viewed writing as kind of a problem, because what ends up happening is that it's like he viewed memory as like a muscle, okay? And you need to exercise it, otherwise it'll atrophy just like a muscle, right? If you don't lift weights or you don't use a muscle, it's going to become weaker and weaker and weaker. Same thing applies to our memory. And if we were to rely, what happens when we write stuff down is we rely on it less and less. And so he thought, all right, that would be bad for the memory if we just wrote everything down. So kind of an interesting position. But regardless, right, he doesn't write anything himself. So there is this kind of question, how do we really know anything about Socrates then? Okay, well, primarily, as I mentioned in the top top bullet point here on the slide, what we know about him is primarily gleaned through Plato's dialogues. Okay, well, will the real Socrates please stand up? I mean, how do we know what Socrates was really like? Okay, I mean, we have the Socrates, the dialogical Socrates character in these dialogues, but there's always this open-ended question, was that meant to indicate what the real Socrates said? Or is it Plato sort of imagining what Socrates might say in these various scenarios? Is it some sort of mixture? Or is it really like Plato and what he thought, and he's just kind of putting it in the character of his mentor, Socrates? So there's this question, what was Socrates really like? Now, we do have other historical figures referencing this dude named Socrates as well. So insofar as we can really know anything about history, right? I mean, we can be fairly confident that this dude named Socrates really existed. But there is this kind of debate, you might say, in the scholarship, to what extent do we really know that much about Socrates, what he was really like? In what sense can we know anything definitively about that? That's certainly an issue that we debate. Okay? And for better or worse, most of what we think we know about Socrates is, again, gleaned through Plato's portrait of him in these dialogues. So as Guthrie writes, Socrates, quote, himself wrote nothing, believing that the only thing of value was the living interchange of ideas by question and answer between two people in personal contact. So again, there is this debate. To what extent does our image of Socrates via these Platonic dialogues really align with the historical dude named Socrates? Okay. Questions, comments, concerns? I think we went through most of the stuff on Socrates, pretty straightforward. Okay, well, we've mentioned Plato, especially here at the end, in terms of, well, he's really the main means by which we think we know about Socrates. Okay, it's through Plato's dialogue. So Plato, I mentioned here, arguably even more important in the history of philosophy. Of course, he was inspired by Socrates, so you might make the case, well, Socrates is really the most important. But they're both very, very key figures in the history of philosophy. So you've probably heard of Plato coming into class as well. Born, I have his dates up here, and he's on the roadmap over here as well. He had two brothers and a sister, and the brothers will show up in some of Plato's dialogues, including in the Republic. So it's kind of interesting. He has all these various characters. A lot of them, in fact, maybe all of them, they're based on historical, actual people, right, that he interacted with. So find that interesting as well. So there is this kind of like, again, this question, to what extent do all these characters in the dialogues, right, to what extent is what they say in these dialogues actually indicative of what they said historically in real life? So this point at the bottom of the slide, and this will become more, we'll elaborate on this more, especially in the next lecture when we kind of get at maybe some more of the points, the theoretical points that these guys are making. Because a lot of their points of emphasis, Plato and Socrates, are going to be at odds with the Sophists or the Sophists, okay, or Sophism or Sophism, however you want to say it. Okay? So this, the Sophists for Socrates and Plato, these guys draw their ire. Okay? These are like kind of the best analogy would be like to think of like politicians and lawyers nowadays. Right? They were kind of like the politicians and lawyers. Okay, and Socrates and Plato, the philosophers that they are, right? There's this concern for the truth above all else. The Sophists, that's not the case. In fact, a lot of what irks Socrates and Plato about the Sophists is their relativism, this notion that their extensive skepticism and the idea that there really ultimately is no truth or knowledge. Okay, Socrates and Plato are going to resist that idea. There are a lot of things about the Sophists at the time, right, that really bothered Socrates and Plato. Okay? This idea, right, the skepticism that there is no truth, their manner of speech, and their concern not with the truth, as the philosophers are concerned with, like Plato and Socrates, that's what they were after. Rather, the politicians, the lawyers, the Sophists, what they're concerned with is instead not what's true, but persuasion, getting people to believe certain things. Okay, that's why I think lawyers, right? What's the main objective? Not to get to the truth, but to get certain people to believe certain things. Okay? Again, doesn't sit well with Socrates and Plato. Another feature is the Sophists would oftentimes charge for their teachings. This didn't sit well with Socrates and Plato, who thought no teacher should ever require pay. I don't know what I'm supposed to do for a living, right? But that was the suggestion. Okay, so again, we'll develop and elaborate on some of this stuff, especially in the next lecture. But just at this point, no, right? The Sophists, they are in the crosshairs of a lot of what Socrates and a lot of what they have to say is directed towards the Sophists. Okay. Anybody have any questions at this point? Yeah. Oh, he had a huge following. Plato is like probably the only one I could maybe name, I guess. I mean, if I thought about it, or maybe somebody might, oh yeah, this. But no, he had like a following, right? I mean, a large portion of the youth were enamored with Socrates, were following him around, right? So Plato was far from being the only one that was considerably influenced by Socrates. I mean, there are a lot of people that were profoundly influenced. I mean, to the point where they're willing, you know, after Socrates has been found guilty and sentenced to death, there are people so enamored with him that they're willing to go and pay off the guards, right, to sort of fund Socrates' escape. Okay, and then Socrates famously, as documented in Plato's dialogue called Credo, famously rejects that. Even though he could have escaped with no issue, the guards didn't even really want Socrates to die, right? He could have easily left, but he famously suggests that's not the right thing to do. Okay, and our main prerogative should always be to do what's right, not to live, per se. Right? You should always do what's right above all else. And since the right thing to do, he thought, was to accept the decision of the state, then he had an obligation, even though it would yield his own death, to stay put and accept the penalty. Right? But yeah, so the whole reason for me bringing that up was just that, you know, you had people that liked him so much that they're willing to go to these lengths, right, to try to get him out. Yeah. Okay, so there's a little intro on Plato. So this is actually, I think a lot of people are pretty familiar with Socrates' influence on Plato, but I don't think it's as widely known or at least appreciated. Pythagoras' right, influence on Plato, which this slide is really, right, picking up on. Okay, so especially towards the middle of Plato's life, and then subsequently the middle dialogues, and then onward, the middle and later dialogues, you're really going to see Pythagoras and his influence on Plato kind of shining through in these dialogues. So I like what I've done here on this slide. If you were to try to kind of capture Plato, the philosopher, and kind of his view and his inspirations for those views, if you will, in a kind of math equation, as maybe Pythagoras might suggest we should try to do, it would look something like this. Okay, there's no doubt Socrates, huge influence on Plato. Okay, but Pythagoras, arguably, especially again towards the middle and later periods in Socrates or Plato's life, was arguably just as influential. Okay. And I think is it Cornford? Yeah, Cornford reflects on this when he writes, quote, "Platonism proper dates in fact from the confluence of those two streams of inspiration, the Socratic and the Pythagorean." Okay, so yeah, Plato, most of us, or it's pretty widely known, Socrates' influence on him, but also know Pythagoras, very influential on Plato. Okay. So I've been referencing these dialogues. Plato's dialogues, pretty big deal in philosophy. You know, his form or the style that he does his philosophy, dialogues, that's pretty unique. You don't see a lot of philosophers writing in dialogues. Okay, you do see it occasionally. We will wrestle with actually David Hume's dialogues on religion later in the semester, but really there's only a couple kind of other instances of dialogues that come to mind in the history of philosophy. Really, it's by and large mostly just Plato that writes in this dialogue form, which is really fascinating in itself. Okay, a couple things to be said about the dialogue form, and I don't know where these come in the slides, but I'm just going to get into them, right? In one sense, writing in dialogue form is good because it's more accessible, right? For you guys, presumably it's easier to kind of get into a story than it is to read a long, dry, boring treatise. It's easier to kind of to get interested, right, in a story that involves characters discussing things. So I would argue that writing in this dialogue form makes Plato at least a little bit more accessible than he might otherwise be. Okay, so again, one of the benefits I would argue in writing in this kind of style is that it is arguably more accessible. One of the problems, and I think I get into this maybe on the next slide, is that we don't really know if somebody, all they're going to offer us is dialogues or stories with various characters saying things, none of whom are named Plato. Plato is never a character in these dialogues. How do we actually know what the author really thought then? Will the real Plato please stand up? What does Plato actually think? Again, should we assume that the character Socrates is actually kind of what Plato thinks himself, or is it kind of a hybrid of what the real historical Socrates thought and what Plato thinks, or not at all, right? Is Plato's view not at all sort of shining through in what the character Socrates says? And in that case, where do we find Plato's view? What does Plato actually think? That, I would argue, is one of the big detriments of writing entirely in dialogue form, is that it's much more difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain what the author actually thinks. Okay, so there's this question to what does Plato actually think? Kind of getting ahead of myself here. Let's go back to Plato just writing in this dialogue form. He was very much, in some sense, every bit as much an artist, right, a creative genius, you might say, as he was a philosopher. He obviously had an ability to discuss and examine profound philosophical issues, but he did it in a very creative, artistic way as well. And so that's kind of what I'm going after at the top of the slide here. As Guthrie writes, quote, "The dialogues are as much literature as philosophy and as much drama as literature." So definitely a unique, interesting style on Plato's parts. So the middle here, I already kind of referenced this. Maybe you could say maybe more appealing than typical essays in philosophy, right? A little bit more accessible. Okay. Curious to hear maybe your guys' thoughts on that. Once you kind of have some more exposure, reading, you should have read, right, some of the dialogue for this week. And then once you get more experience reading other writings in philosophy, like kind of comparing them, would you agree with some of this, right? Does it seem like the dialogues are a little bit more accessible? But that's kind of my general takeaway. You do, as I mentioned here, there is a lot of irony in Plato's writings as well. And that's something that I think doesn't really get appreciated until you become more and more kind of familiar with Plato and you've read him a little bit more and maybe more familiar with Greek culture at the time. You really start to pick up on just how pervasive a lot of the irony is in Plato's writings and just how humorous he can be. Mentioned down at the bottom, Aristotle, right, Plato's student. So Aristotle is in Plato's academy for a long time, studies under Plato's, right? He's under Plato's tutelage for decades, up until Plato, I want to say until Plato died, when Aristotle was like, don't quote me on this, but in his late 30s, maybe like 38, 39 years old. Aristotle is under Plato's influence up until that point. And then finally Aristotle goes off once Plato dies and forms his own school, equally famous school in philosophy known as the Lyceum, right? But Aristotle, again, very much influenced by Plato for an extensive period of time. So I mentioned Aristotle at the bottom because at least what we have that survived, now supposedly only 20% of Aristotle's original writings have survived. The point here, though, is what we have at least that still exists couldn't be more different in terms of its style than these dialogues from Plato, right? These treatises from Aristotle have that more traditional, I don't want to say necessarily dry or boring feel, but they definitely have that more typical essay style, right, of more traditional philosophical writings. Okay. Now, supposedly, Aristotle, this always kind of threw me for a loop. Like, if you studied with the dude for 20 plus years, you'd think you would, at some point, kind of mirror his style here and there, right? But we don't have any dialogues from Aristotle that have survived. But supposedly, Aristotle did write some dialogues. They just didn't survive. So that kind of always made sense to me, because I would have thought it would be weird otherwise. Like, how could you go 20 plus years studying with someone who writes entirely in dialogue form and never write a dialogue yourself? That would be a little weird. But anyway, so I always like kind of pointing to the contrast between like Plato and how he reads versus Aristotle, or at least what we have, right? Very kind of different, for better or worse. So hopefully, this is somewhere here. Hopefully you can see now, given some of the things we've alluded to, why I have this slide here. You will oftentimes hear me say Socrates/Plato or Plato/Socrates, because I don't know who to attribute what to, for all the reasons we've already gotten into, right? What does Plato actually think? We don't know. All he gives us are stories with various characters, none of whom are called Plato. So like, what does Plato, the author, actually think? Okay. So too, what does Socrates actually think, since he never wrote anything himself? And most of what we think we know about Socrates is gleaned through these Platonic dialogues and what the dialogical character Socrates says. But again, are we just trusting, putting faith in this idea that, well, then that must have been really what the real historical Socrates said? Because that would be more or less faith, right? How do we know? And so all of these reasons are the rationale behind me oftentimes referencing them then as Socrates/Plato or Plato/Socrates, because there is this issue, again, who do we ascribe what to? Blah, blah, blah. So I think that's basically the top there. And then I'm going to have a quote that basically echoes this from Guthrie. He suggests Socrates, quote, thought is so closely connected with Plato's, and it's, quote, difficult to be sure where the thought of Socrates ends and that of Plato begins. So he's kind of referencing these interpretive difficulties as well. Okay? Who really thinks what? There is this live question, I would say. Okay? Now, having said all that, so the bottom point is me saying, at the same time, there do seem to be some palpable, appreciable differences between, at least from what we think we can gather from the dialogues, between Socrates and Plato. Okay? So Socrates kind of famously was well known for being almost exclusively interested in kind of human-centric issues. So much so that, so you see down here, I referenced the Socratic turn. So we had the Socratic turn that occurred in ancient philosophy. This kind of references that this idea that with Socrates' arrival, philosophical considerations turned to almost exclusively like human-related issues. So up until Socrates, with like the pre-Socratics and so on, you had a lot of interest in, say, in the basic fundamental nature of the universe, metaphysics and so on. But with Socrates, you see a lot less of that, hence the Socratic turn. Okay? You see a lot less of that in almost exclusively a concern with human related issues, ethics, politics, how we should treat one another, etc. So again, that's the idea of the Socratic turn. And the whole point here is that with Plato, especially early on, the early portion of the middle dialogues, they're very much catering to what interested Socrates. But you do see with Plato, especially later in his career, a wider interest, right? A wider scope in terms of his interest than you see with Socrates, right? Plato, you do see some interest in these wider issues, more general issues, right? Metaphysics and so on. Okay, so that's the point here at the bottom. Okay, so everybody, not that you need to know necessarily the Socratic term, but I'm referencing it here, so I want to make sure that I explained it. Again, that's the kind of the point in the ancient era where philosophical sort of discussions turned to almost exclusively discussions about human-related issues. And then, again, with Plato, you see him kind of branching out a little bit more, especially in the middle to later dialogues. So as I mentioned at the top here, many of these dialogues, so I've referenced the dialogues a few times now, many of them have like kind of a general pattern, a lot of similarities. Okay? So somebody's going to profess they know something. Socrates would be like, oh, here we go. Go over, starts questioning them, applying the Socratic method. Okay? And then over time, teasing out what getting them to sort of explain what they think they know, he gets them to realize, or at least everyone else to realize, this person doesn't really know what they suggested they knew. Okay? And really gets the person kind of to reach a state of confusion in some sense, right? Exposes how they don't really know, Socrates, through this discussion, right, exposes to them how they don't really know what they thought they knew. Okay? And so that sort of state, which is usually how the dialogue then ends, is the person that Socrates is discussing things with, right, his interlocutor, the one professing to know stuff, kind of starts to realize maybe Socrates is onto something. I really don't have this knowledge I thought I did, right? And there's this kind of sense of confusion. What now, right? Well, that kind of state of confusion is known as aporia, okay? And a lot of the dialogues, especially the earlier ones, tended to end in this kind of state, right? With the person that Socrates is discussing things with kind of left in a complete state of confusion, unsure what to do next, usually very annoyed with Socrates and running off as quickly as possible. Okay? But that whole kind of state of confusion, not sure what to do next, right? That's known as aporia, and that was oftentimes where the dialogue ended. Okay. As I mentioned, second bullet point here, Socrates is certainly the MVP. He shows up in dialogues throughout Plato's career, but especially the early and then the middle. Okay? He's for sure the MVP, steering the course of the discussions. Okay? Oftentimes asking the pertinent, most important questions, applying that Socratic method. Not really offering positions himself, right? But again, trying to solicit the positions of the people he's talking to and teasing out what exactly they think through that Socratic method. So I already mentioned that, right? He almost without fail gets whoever he's talking to realize they don't actually know what they thought they knew. Okay? Or at least that's hopefully what they get to realize. Everyone else around is kind of realizing that. So as I mentioned at the bottom, you would think then that this would lead them to question and reassess what they think they know, but oftentimes they just get super annoyed with Socrates and run off as quickly as possible. So that's the notion of aporia, that kind of state of utter confusion that a lot of these dialogues ended with. So not really a happy ending for a lot of these dialogues either. Okay. So real quick, I've been referencing these dialogues. I want to get into them and how they're categorized and say a little bit more about each of the sort of categories of the dialogues. Okay, nothing too in-depth here. This will be pretty cursory. But so Plato's dialogues, pretty famously known, right? These dialogues. It depends on who you ask or at what point. But the last time I checked, by most recent accounts, there's up to like 35 of these dialogues are attributed to Plato. Now, there are some scholarly disputes, well, this one, so there are certain ones that like most of the scholars suggest definitely were written by Plato. Some that are a little bit, fuzzier and debatable. This seems like it could have been, but maybe not, right? So the idea is, a lot of these we know definitively, insofar as we can know anything about history, what happens, thousands of years ago, right? We're pretty confident were authored by Plato, and then some maybe not quite as sure, okay, but again, most recent estimates were that he authored up to 35 dialogues, some of which are very, very long. Not all of them, but some of them are like hundreds of pages long. So I've already shown you the Republic, right? This is one dialogue. Now, granted, Alan Bloom is the interpreter or translator for this, and there is like a 100-page essay at the end. So this isn't all the Republic, but it's 300 plus pages. So it's a long dialogue. Laws was his last dialogue. That was hundreds of pages long too. So not only did he write a lot of dialogue, but some of them were pretty long as well. So typically, the dialogues are sort of divided categorically in terms of the chronology, right? So we have early, middle, then late, okay? And we sort of kind of already described the early ones, right? This is where Socrates is for sure the MVP. He's driving most of the discussion. You have a lot of back and forth. There aren't like long-winded speeches like you'll see in some of the later dialogues. There's a lot more of the back and forth discussion, the Socratic method. Okay, Socrates is steering a lot of that discussion. Okay, some examples of early dialogues would be the Apology, and we'll say a lot from the Apology in the next lecture. In Credo, I referenced that dialogue. That's the dialogue that chronicles sort of the discussion after Socrates was sentenced, when Socrates is in his cell, right? And they've arranged for him to escape, and he declines that. The Credo is the dialogue that gives an account of that. Okay? So I already mentioned that, right? Socrates is the MVP for sure. He's dominating the discussion. The issues tend to be, right, what Socrates was interested in. Remember the Socratic turn, so a lot of ethics, political science, or politics, those sorts of issues, which is what I'm mentioning at the bottom here. Friendship, love, virtue, what we owe to each other, what we owe to the government and state, etc. What is that? Okay. The middle dialogues, in some sense, you can kind of view as like a transition period, because again, this is the point in Plato's life where he really is exposed to Pythagoras for the first time. I think I mentioned, at the bottom there, during this middle period is when Plato traveled to southern Italy and was really exposed, not to Pythagoras himself, but the schools. There were a couple in particular major schools of thought that were born out of Pythagoras' thought. And again, Plato kind of encounters these schools for the first time. Okay, and you can definitely then see the influence on the dialogues he writes from that point on. Okay. So as I mentioned, the middle here, the middle dialogues begin to offer Plato some of his own positions on things. He starts to explore, issues beyond just ethics and the things that interested Socrates, right? He starts to explore some of those bigger issues, you might say, the non-human focused issues, not bigger necessarily, right? But the non-human related issues like the fundamental nature of the universe, et cetera. Some of those questions, right? Plato starts to kind of address. You start to get some of his famous theory of the forms So again, a metaphysical sort of view. That starts to come out in some of these middle dialogues, but that'll especially be articulated in the later dialogues as well. But anyway, I would say the middle era or middle dialogues are best viewed as kind of a transition period where you really start to see Pythagoras and his influence shine through in Plato. Speaking of which, as Cornford observes, quote, "From this quarter, a fresh stream flowed into the current of Plato's thought. Pythagorean influence is everywhere traceable in the dialogues of the middle period." Okay. And then that leaves us with the late dialogues. I would say these are much more obscure. As I say somewhere here in the middle there, the scholars have always, and I'm definitely on board with this, have always suggested the late dialogues are the most difficult. Like I said, they tend to be more obscure, abstract. A lot of them dabble in metaphysics, which by its nature can be, again, more abstract and more difficult on a whole. So some examples, I mentioned laws. That was the last dialogue of Plato's. Okay. Timaeus is another example. We see less of Socrates. So again, chronologically, you see less and less Socrates as the dialogues progress. Okay. He's always somewhat present in a lot of these dialogues, okay, but you'll see less of him. And you see more of a development of Plato's own unique views, more of an exploration on Plato's part, exploring those other issues, right, the non-human-centered issues, okay, the ones that Socrates himself was less inclined to explore or be interested in. Yeah, so one of the things that, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, one of the things that I think yields a lot of the difficulty is that you get a lot more long-winded kind of speeches or passages in these late dialogues, right? There's less of the Socratic method and more just, 3-page, one character speaking for like 3 pages at a time. And so it can naturally just be more difficult to parse some of that. All right, and so again, that's one of the aspects of these later dialogues that can make them more difficult. And I mentioned that part at the very bottom there, that point. As Guthrie writes, quote, "Unlike Socrates, Plato had a keen interest in the problems of the nature of reality for their own sake, especially in these later dialogues." Okay. Questions, comments, concerns? All right, well, let's do a little reflection. So question 1 kind of is asking you to gauge your familiarity, your coming into the course, your familiarity with these 2 characters, Plato and Socrates. If you did have kind of an idea of them coming into class, what was your previous impression of them? And then number 2, well, what are your impressions of them now, in particular Socrates? What do you think of this guy? Now, granted, you don't know him, right? You don't engage with him on the daily, so to speak. You only really know of him what I've kind of suggested and maybe what you gleaned from the reading. Okay, but based on that, impressions of Socrates at this point, will this be somebody you would like to hang out with on a daily basis or maybe every once in a while? And then third, what did you associate with philosophy or philosophical writings coming into class? And I know you've given this a lot of thought, right? But when you thought of like philosophy and the writings associated with philosophy, what did you have in mind? Was it long, boring scrolls, treatises of some sort, or was it engaging stories or dialogue? So what did you kind of associate with philosophy? Okay, so let's go ahead and break up into our groups and reflect on these questions, and we'll get back together and share our answers here in a little bit.